Buon pomeriggio a tutti.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let's start our meeting with our guest, Mrs. Karla Hoff, who will talk about spite, stigma, and economic development. You may think that these are three words that are far apart one from the other, especially if you follow the usual approach to studies on economic development. But you will probably understand from Professor Hoff's presentation that there are important connections, there are very deep connections between these three elements, which refer to deep cultural, psychological, social, and historical characteristics within which individuals make their own life decisions, and the possibility that exclusion, marginalization, and poverty occur. So you will listen to a way to interpret research on poverty and a new interpretation of the role of the economist with tools and viewpoints which may not be known to the large audience, but which are a very fertile field of research at the moment, a field which is expanding rapidly. Our guest is a highly qualified witness of this kind of studies. She is visiting researcher at the Princeton University, and she's also senior research economist at the World Bank. Her studies have already been published in numerous illustrious magazines, and she's also co-author of a book with Professor Durlaf with the title Poverty Traps. Those poverty traps in which individuals or social groups may become trapped. So I would like, without further ado, to leave the floor to our guest, and at the end we will have some time for a Q&A session.
So thank you very much for including me in your illustrious conference. I've never been to a festival of economics. Thank you for inviting me. I've never been to a festival of economics. I think it's a brilliant idea. It's fun for me. It's fun for a lot of other people. My talk is closely related to John's talk this morning and also Tor's talk a moment ago, in that it builds on relationships between psychology and economics. So just to set the frame, there's a field of psychology which begins with the subject of preferences. There's a field of economics which takes preferences as given, and it begins with their consequences. And that was until the field of behavioral economics, or much, much earlier, all the work in the 17th and 18th centuries, which was completely ignored in economics in the 20th century until the behavioral revolution. The old work emphasizing psychology, like the new work in behavioral economics, emphasizes the link between economic structure and psychology. If you seek esteem, the structure of your economy will influence those activities which are viewed as estimable. So though certainly the deep psychology of man is the same everywhere, the drive for esteem will take you very different places depending upon where you are. So there's a crack in the wall between economics and psychology. Distributional preferences in particular, I'm going to argue in my talk, can be learned. What I mean by distributional preferences are other regarding preferences. Altruism, spite. There was a famous paper 28 years ago entitled Economist's Free Ride, does anybody else? Do you know this paper? A non-representative sample knows this paper. In the US, it got a lot of play. So the idea was, economists played students were asked to play an experiment in which they could contribute voluntarily to a public good or not. And it was discovered that the econ majors followed the assumptions of economics, were completely selfish, they didn't contribute. But the non-econ majors, they violated that assumption and they gave. So that was a crack in the wall that got a lot of attention and a lot of laughs. It seemed to be that economics was a subject about economists rather than about people in general. But it did raise the question, are economists different in these games because they have self-selected into the field of economics? Or, that's the blue line, or are they different because of their exposure to the culture of economics? Every field has its ideology. Is this okay? Oh, thank you for answering. Yes, this can be participatory. You can yell out answers, so that's great. So this man in the audience says, it's not that you self-select, it's that you learn. Well, I would now like to mention in the bottom of this slide a natural experiment at Yale Law School, which doesn't prove that you don't self-select, but it does prove that you do learn. In other words, it proves that the red element is present. And this natural experiment takes advantage of the fact that first-year Yale Law students are randomly assigned to teachers in the required courses. And some of these teachers have PhDs in economics, and some of them don't. A year after these students participated in the courses, a sample of them was asked to play games. And lo and behold, the students that had been randomly put into classes taught by instructors with PhDs in economics played significantly different than those who had not. The students of the PhDs in econ were more selfish and more concerned with efficiency. And this is after just 1 year's exposure to courses. The question I address here is, how does social structure, in particular, how does your affiliation to a particular part of the social structure shape your social identity and, in particular, your distributional preferences? And I will ask, how do they affect cooperation? And I will argue that cooperation is very important for development. But to address this, I can't just play games with different kinds of people, because then I would face the same difficulty as was faced in evaluating the question, economist's free ride, does anybody else? To evaluate this, I have to go someplace where social status is assigned by birth rather than earned. Obviously, people who achieve a great deal, who are at the top of a meritocratic system, are going to have somewhat different characteristics. So that wouldn't be a good place to go. So I go to rural North India. In rural North India, there are stark historical differences in the rights between high status and low status castes. The low status castes were untouchables. They couldn't go into public places. They couldn't enter into any but menial occupations. They couldn't accumulate wealth. And they were relentlessly stigmatized. You have your caste membership by birth. And although certainly caste outcome, like almost every other outcome in society, is a political process, those castes that are at the top of the caste hierarchy, the Brahmins, for example, have been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the untouchables have pretty much been stuck for hundreds, if not thousands of years. This died, I think. Did it die? No, okay. And so this is just a wonderful place to go to avoid the problem of meritocracy. And yet, because the caste system was officially outlawed with India's independence in 1947, and there was land reform all over the country, there is an overlap in the distribution of wealth, income, and education between high and low caste. So it's not that all high castes are richer than all low castes. And in my papers, I show that explicitly, and I'll show that here as well. So we can compare the effect of caste status holding constant education and wealth. And thus we can make an argument that it's the caste status itself that is going to drive very large differences in behavior in 3 experiments I will describe. So this brings me to my paper. My paper is about spite and its effect on coordination, stigma and its effect on norm enforcement, and thus implicitly it's about development. It's about the way social structure which reflects differences in power a long time ago shapes who people are and thus their capacity for solving the kinds of problems that come up all the time in any society and are perhaps particularly important in a poor society. I go to Uttar Pradesh, which is in North India. Experiment 1 is about coordination. It's a repeated game. In each period, a player has an endowment of 6 monetary units. So he's given 6 of these little tokens. And he's allowed a binary choice. He can put all 6 of them. So notice this has 5 columns. So he's going to be making his decision by putting tokens each period into the first row. So if he decides to cooperate, he'll put in all 6 of his tokens. And if his partner makes a different choice, remember I said there's a binary choice? You can cooperate by investing all in a joint project, or you can defect by keeping 4 tokens in your pocket and contributing just 2. If the partner who's in another location contributes just 2, then a messenger will come and show this player that his partner has contributed just 2. And in that case of miscoordination, the poor first player will get a very low return. He started with 6, and his whole payoff is just 3 tokens. And he will see that. So we call this the loser's payoff. He started with 6, he cooperated, he put all 6 in the joint project, but his partner didn't cooperate, so he only gets to have 2. Now, after each period, he learns the decision of the partner. And I've explained that if he cooperated, he gets a high payoff. Oh, now let me explain. So suppose now he's going to be trusting, and he's going to say to himself, well, I'm going to give my partner another chance. So again, he's going to put all 6 tokens in. Now, if his partner is nice and cooperates, his partner will put also 6 tokens in. The messenger will show that. Of course, these players never come face to face or know each other's names. And then he will get a very high payoff. I don't want to count them all, but he will get 10. So he started with 6 tokens, and his payoff will be 10. So if a player cooperates, he gets a high payoff if his partner cooperates, but a low payoff if the partner defects. Now, if he defects, he always gets the same no matter what. That's strange. Mutual cooperation is an equilibrium. If I believe the other person will cooperate, of course I want to cooperate, and then we get really high payoffs. But mutual defection is also, this is very strange. Why did it? I don't know. It doesn't work anymore. It's okay. But mutual defection is also an equilibrium. There are fixed pairings for 5 periods, and it's all anonymous. The experiment, here's the key point. The experiment mimics situations of coordination on drainage. For example, if I build a drain and you build a drain and the other people on our path build a drain, then the path is not muddy. But if I'm the only one that builds a drain, I lose my effort and still the path is muddy. Timing of planting, forming a cooperative, forming a new convention, a new institution. All these problems arise every day. And the canonical example is from David Hume, to pick up an author that Tor discussed. The canonical example is rowing a boat. If we both row, we go someplace, and that's a high payoff for both of us. If I row and you don't row, I lose my effort, and we don't go anywhere. If I don't row, I don't lose my effort, we don't go anywhere. I don't care whether you row or not. So I'm happy if I don't row if I think you're not going to row. If I don't row, I always get the same. I go nowhere, but I don't lose any effort. So the player sees the full history of the game in the game box. And lo and behold, most low caste pairs achieve success in coordination. And that's also true with fixed pairings of students in the United States and in Barcelona, and in many other parts of the world where these games have been played. So I have to explain the picture. The dark areas are about failure. There are 2 ways to fail. One way is, I row and you don't, or you row and I don't. That's the worst. Another way to fail is that we both don't row. Then we don't get what I call the loser's payoff, but on the other hand, we miss a chance to go someplace in our boat. We miss the chance for a high payoff. We miss the chance to build a new convention, a new institution. Success is the yellow. So failure is on the left-hand side of each, and the proportion failure is a minority in period 5, and it's an even smaller minority in period 10 for the low caste pairs. Does anyone else? Not the high caste. I was truly amazed by this result. The high caste pairs, who are the more educated, the more sophisticated, and with their hands on power, they should be used to solving problems. They can't coordinate. Even after 5 periods, very, very few of them are both rowing the boat. After 10 periods, this is the second fixed pairing. They're doing a little better, but still a very large fraction, more than 50%, are failing to coordinate. And the mixed status pairs are in between. How, in theory, do people coordinate? So like a French person, I first have to ask how people do things in theory. The challenge in this kind of game is to build a reputation for cooperating. If you build a challenge for cooperating, then your partner will, in his own self-interest, wish to cooperate too. And then you'll both get the high payoff. So let's look at period by period outcomes. This is for periods 1 through 5. On the left-hand side, here are the low caste. Remember that yellow represents success. And notice, the success rate is higher every single period. The blue area look at the key. The blue is where one is rowing and one is not, and the red is where neither one is rowing. That is to say, both are defecting. So red is both defecting. So you get fewer and fewer cases of both defecting and more cases of both cooperating. And that's just the way it's supposed to work. And that's the way it works with university students in the West. Not so with a high caste. They simply can't get it together. There is no progress whatsoever. What is wrong with them? They do not differ. They do not differ significantly in the probability of cooperating in the initial period. In the initial period, you're really revealing your type. You're revealing your trustworthiness. And there's only a slightly smaller probability of cooperation by the high than by the low caste. But in the later periods, they act differently. When do they act differently? A high caste person who obtains the loser's payoff in the first period of a pairing is 35% less likely than a low caste person to continue to cooperate in the next period. So he cannot establish a reputation for cooperation. Why is that? For a long time, I had no idea. I thought they were crazy. This establishes the result. I pool all of the results for the second period of a fixed pairing. So period 1 and period 6 are your first times with a new partner. And I find controlling for everything, I get a 35% difference in the probability of cooperation if I'm a high caste, and nothing else is significant. After a history of mutual defection, after a history in which I defect and my partner cooperates, or when both cooperate, there's no difference significantly between a high and low caste. It's only after getting the loser's payoff, that is, I cooperated, my partner didn't, that high caste distinguish themselves. So, is this a possible response to loss of face? Suppose you initially earn the loser's payoff. So you rowed the boat. Your partner didn't. You got a low payoff. Low in absolute terms and low compared to him. Do you perceive this as an insult? Would you be insulted if you were playing this game and you put in all your tokens and your partner didn't? Well, if you did, you might want to punish him. But you might look at it another way. You might perceive this as an honest misunderstanding. If he didn't trust that I would cooperate, if he didn't know I was such a wonderful person, then he might, even though he's a wonderful person, have defected simply in response to thinking I would defect. So I'm going to correct his misunderstanding. I'm going to cooperate. One interpretation of the outcome we obtained is that the high caste perceive an insult. The low caste perceive a misunderstanding. So the high caste punish in the second period, which means they cannot establish a reputation for cooperation. And the low caste, perceiving a misunderstanding, they continue to cooperate in order to establish trust. And we saw that they did ultimately establish trust. A year later, I decided to test this idea. I tested this idea to provide more direct evidence that we're measuring differences in preferences rather than just differences in trust. So we go back to the same set of villages, although we have different subjects. Now I'm going to describe experiment 2. Experiment 2 is very simple. It's a dictator game, as Tor described, but it's even simpler than his game. You don't get to pick whether you want to give 10 euros or 9 euros or 8 euros or 0 euros to your partner. You just get to pick one way of dividing money or another. And it's anonymous and it's double blind, so that the only pressures you feel in making this choice come from inside yourself, not from being watched. This is how the setup looks for the players. They will say, okay, there could be 100 rupees, this 250s, for yourself and 100 for your partner, or there could be 150 and 100, or all different kinds of choices. So I will give you 4 examples, though we did more. Which do you want? 90 rupees for your partner and 90s for yourself, or 70 for your partner and 90 for yourself? Now, 90 is a lot of money. It's more than 1 day's wage. It's almost 2 days' wage for an unskilled worker. So this is real money. I asked my daughter, and she said, well, of course 90-90. Who wouldn't want 90-90? Why do you want to hurt your partner? He's someone like you who's living in your very own village. 40% of the high caste choose the spiteful option. They choose the second option, 70 for their partner, 90 for them. In other words, they're not willing, 40% are not willing to have the partner get the same. Another choice. You could get 100, or you could give 110, or if you give up 100, then your partner will lose 80. So here, the second choice means you are paying for the privilege of hurting somebody else. Okay? So clearly, a totally self-interested person would say, 110 is bigger than 100, I'll go for 110, and who cares about my partner? But a spiteful person would say, if I get 110, it's true I have more money, but my partner has even more than I do. Now again, this is anonymous. This is just another person in the village. However, life is really about symbols and meaning as much as it is about anything else, and if you're a spiteful person, you won't like that. So 40% of the people choose the second option if they're high caste, and only 29 if they're low caste. Now I'm going to show you 2 last choices, and these are about charity, not about spite. Here I'm going to ask whether you're willing to give up 10 in order that your partner would get 50. You could have 130. Or you could give up 10 and have 120, and then your partner would get 50 more. And this is exactly the same. You could give up 10, 160 to 150, and then your partner would have 50 more. What's the difference between these 2 options? Think of yourself as doing the charitable thing. Suppose you do the charitable thing. Then in the first case, you have less than your partner. But in the second case, you have the same. So a charitable person would choose the same option irrespective, would be the same in these two cases. But someone who was concerned with relative payoff would make very different choices. He might want to be charitable as long as he's not behind, but if he's behind, then he doesn't. So this is the outcome. For the high caste, they don't want, 50% does not want to be charitable when the outcome of charity is to put their partner ahead. But only 27 doesn't want to be charitable. In other words, 73 want to be charitable if it's 50-50. So it seems they like the idea of charity. They like the idea of giving up only 10 to help someone by 50, but only if that doesn't make the other person a bigger lion than they are. But the low caste, they don't even see a difference. They act just the same. So the conclusion so far is that for low caste individuals, social preferences that we estimate from these games are very similar to those estimated for university students in the US and Barcelona. There's no spite, and there's a little charity. But high caste individuals have different social preferences. They are more spiteful. Now, this game was double blind, so I cannot link the behavior of individuals to any characteristic other than their caste. But I have, from the earlier experiment, individual characteristics, and I know that even controlling for individual characteristics, the high caste played the game very differently. I show in a model that I won't show here that spiteful preferences can explain the absence of coordination by the high caste. And here's a way to make sense of it. In a feudal environment or in a traditional society, he who has political power soon acquires wealth as a kind of consequence. But in a commercial and industrial society, the best way to make money is to make money. It's quite possible to do this without acquiring power. So here's the point. I argue that living as the elite in a traditional feudal society has made the high caste very concerned with relative payoffs. And that concern is a barrier to coordination. Thus, opportunities for everyone to become better off are missed because a response to a mistake is taken as an insult. The insult is punished. The punishment blocks reputation formation. Without trust, you don't get to full coordination. Here's my last experiment. This is an experiment about another kind of cooperation. Now I'm not concerned about coordinating, like you drive on the left, I'll drive on the left, or you drive on the right, I'll drive on the right. You row the boat, I'll row the boat. Now I'm concerned about norm enforcement. Two individuals, a trustor and a trustee, play a sequential exchange game. And then there's a third party who could punish. And the three players that interact come from distant villages. They never see each other. They play the game in their own villages. The experiment mimics informal sanctions of opportunists, cheaters, and free riders. Informal sanctions play a major role in the restraint of opportunism in markets and in collective action. You face this every day. When John Algon this morning was looking at the World Values Survey, he reported results for a question: do you think it's ever justifiable to cheat on government benefits? If you think it's not justifiable, you will insult or criticize or reproach your friends who cheat. You might not want your children to play with children of cheaters. You might not want to marry a cheater. These informal sanctions can be very powerful because people face these things every day. And we are going to ask, is the preference for unselfish enforcement of norms the same for the low and high caste? Treatment 1. The trustor and the third-party punisher are from the same specific caste. So here's the idea. There are 3 people who play this game. Person 1 has 100 monetary units. He decides whether or not to trust them to person 2. Then the money is tripled. And person 2 has a binary choice. He can give half the money back to person 1, or he can keep all of it for himself. Then person 3 can punish person 2 or not. But punishment is costly to person 3. So the idea is to elicit the preferences towards punishment. We don't really care about persons 1 and 2. We care about the willingness to punish. And we have 2 treatments. In one case, the punisher is the same descent group, the same endogamous caste as the victim. And this is the result that we get. We get that there's much more punishment by high caste people than by low caste people. So it's just like you're going to the market and giving someone money to buy his cow, and then he brings in a cow that turns out to be sick or lame. And then you ask for your money back, and he says no. And then you complain. And if you're high caste, the high caste people will stand behind you. And if you're low caste, they'll stand behind you much less. Well, you may say, it costs money to punish. High caste people have more money, so it's just an income effect. If you live in a mud house, you're very poor. And among all the people who live in a mud house, the high caste punish more than the low caste. Among all the people who live in better houses, the high caste punish more than the low caste. If you own low land, you're poor. We look at just those people who own low land. The high caste punish more than the low caste. We look at just those people who own above median land. The high caste punish more than the low caste. We can predict income, we can predict consumption differences based on the education and wealth information we have, and we find no relationship whatsoever between wealth, above average or below average, well, this is above average or below average consumption, and punishment. There's no relationship at all. So the hypothesis that we come up with is that, well, perhaps the high caste have greater in-group affiliation. a lot of literature shows that people favor their own community. I learned today at lunch that there's a recent scandal in Trento where politicians were favoring Trento businessmen for some contract to build roads. I hope I haven't gotten this wrong. But see, that's an example of sort of favoring the in-group. Now, in order to dominate a group as thoroughly as the low caste were dominated, you need to pulverize it. You need to atomize it. You need to stigmatize it. And all these things, the exclusions from public celebration, the bans on marriage ceremonies, make sense because they hindered the low caste from developing a positive and a cohesive group identity. So I'm going to report one last result. Treatment 2. Now, the only difference is person 1, who's trusting, and person 3, who can punish, are not from the same caste. So it's like Thakurs and Brahmins. You know, they're both high caste status, but they're not the same descent group. And now what I find is that this is the new result. This you saw before. This you've seen before. This is the new result. The gap vanishes almost. There's no difference between high caste and low caste. The high caste hardly punish more than the low caste. So it seems that the low caste, whether they are from the same group as the victim, whether they're from the same group as the victim or not from the same group as the victim, they don't care. Whereas the high caste, they care a lot. So there are two interpretations that aren't really distinct. One is strictly an issue of in-group affiliation. The high caste people have had the opportunity to develop in-group loyalty. The low caste people have not. A second interpretation is that the low caste people do not even have the capability to punish those who violate a cooperation norm. They do not have the sense of arrogating to themselves the power to judge and to punish when they themselves have not been able to self-organize. They themselves have not been able to freely form their own culture. They have always been, until independence, and really until quite recently, under the thumb of the high caste. So culture, the glue of society, the thing that makes norms so powerful, that requires space and freedom. It cannot be taken for granted. So the possible consequence is the difficulty in enforcing contracts and sustaining collective action. A perpetuation of a social hierarchy, even if all other obstacles to the low caste are removed. In summary, the contributions of this work are that it identifies new influences on distributional preferences. Whether you are at the top or the bottom of the caste system affects your spite. Whether you are at the top of the bottom of the caste system affects your capability to enforce a cooperation norm. And the second contribution is to suggest new reasons why distributional preferences matter. Usually we say they matter when it comes to voting on tax policy or benefits. But here we see they matter for something much more basic. They matter for the ability to solve a simple problem of whether you will row the boat and I will row the boat. They matter for a simple problem of whether you will punish cheaters. So in conclusion, we argued that concern of high caste with loss of face engenders spite. Social exclusion of low caste hurts in-group affiliation and the capability to punish. And this is my final slide. This is important because if there's capability to punish those who cheat, there's capability to solve a collective action problem. If you can solve a collective action problem, it doesn't matter whether each one of you is a little fish. You can all gang up on the big fish. But if you cannot solve a problem of collective action, the little fish will remain the little fish, and not just because they're little, have less wealth, less political connection, less access to violence, but for a fourth reason. Their social preferences are different. They're pulverized. They're less able to solve a collective action problem. Thank you very much. I have to thank my co-authors, so that slide has disappeared. But this work is, all these experiments, of course I don't do them all by myself. I do them with really wonderful people, and those people's names will be appearing. So Ernst Fair has been a big source of inspiration. Mayor Chetramata is the most energetic Indian I have ever met. And Priyanka Pandey is the most powerful administrator I have ever worked with. And here are some of our papers. Okay.
Bene, siamo noi naturalmente a ringraziare la professoressa Hoff per questa esposizione.
So we're very thankful, Professor Hoff, for this very clear presentation. You provided with a lot of food for thought. I'm sure that there are a lot of questions that people may ask you. So we have some time to take questions from the floor. Thank you very much.
Mani alzate. Let's wait.
Sì.
Pierluigi Congedo, King's College London e Roma 3 Università. Il suo intervento sembra riflettere in...
Your presentation mirrors a study that was published 2008 by Nowak on Nature, on non-cooperative games as applied to a group of students of the MIT, where the cooperation possibility was observed between very smart youths who would prefer to adopt a common line, non-punishing, but rather deserting or defecting. And a similar reaction was registered also in nature amongst bats or vampires, who at the end of the day would throw up a part of the blood that they had drew to give it to the bat which hadn't taken any blood, so that they would have or the vampire rather. So that was an implicit cooperation in nature, again, amongst bats and vampires. My question is as follows. In a number of Western civilizations, do you think that educators can be trained and educated to train the youngest to have cooperative behaviors. I'm referring to the less advantaged areas in Europe where the youngest have no education to cooperation whatsoever. Whereas we see that in other areas, such as in Trentino area, there's a strong capability to develop cooperation in this area where we are here at the moment.
Sì, allora raccogliamo un'altra o altre due domande, poi ci sarà una...
So we'll leave room to a number of other questions, and then we'll give an answer. What about the next question? Would you like to get it in English?
What do you think about a different phenomenon, which could be called noblesse oblige, which is apparently exactly the contrary? That is the idea that if you ask two strong players to decide about the exclusion of a weak player, they could allow the weak player to participate in for example, in a division of a sum of money, if they share some code or sort social norm of fairness within this category, which apparently is what happened when in a Western society people that share the idea of fairness decide to, for example, to punish, this is a second aspect, but to punish another player that for example, act in unfair ways with the third party. For example, social responsible investment typically is this kind of behavior. We share some rule of behavior, and people in the Western society, a small part of them, punish funds that or companies that do not behave according to the same kind of social norms with third party, weak player, for example, people in developing countries. This is a different kind of, in a sense, this could be the higher level caste, because this is not a caste, but it's richer people that apparently want to implement social norms, even also by punishing members that behave in an unfair way with weaker participant or weaker player.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. Is this working? Okay, so the first question, to repeat it, the question was, can you train people to cooperate? This, of course, is a trillion-dollar question. I myself would like to work in this area. Before I give a completely speculative answer, let me describe an experiment I learned about from Pontus Strimling and his co-author, who was visiting Princeton this last year. It was a very interesting experiment. There were two stages to the game. In stage one, individuals having the opportunity to contribute to a public good. There's no punishment. They're generous or they're not, whatever they want. And then, in the second stage, the people who were generous are put in one set of groups, And the people who were not generous are put in another set of groups. They don't know this, of course. And now they're given the opportunity to build up a set of rules, Eleanor Ostrom style. They get to choose 3 things: the mandatory contribution, how much to punish someone who doesn't make the mandatory contribution, and how much to reward a person who monitors. And there's only one efficient outcome. As in any public good game, the efficient outcome is always you contribute everything because it gets doubled or tripled, and then it's shared among everybody. So individually you want a free ride, but collectively your interest is in 100% contribution, because it's like a money machine. And the remarkable result was that those kids, these are university students, who were generous, come up with the efficient set of rules, and those who were stingy do not. So let's go back to the question, can you train people to cooperate? Here we had people whose self-interest lies in cooperation on rules that will make sure nobody cheats on his taxes. Nobody cheats on paying the bus ticket. Nobody cheats on the train ticket. So that, in fact, there's a bus system, a train system, and public parks for everyone. They had this opportunity to cooperate, and those who didn't do it of their own free will in the first game don't seem to be able to settle on an efficient set of rules in the second game. So one interpretation is that people don't want to choose rules that make themselves look bad. Or another interpretation is people just don't like rules. So if you would have done it anyway, you're happy to have those rules. But if you wouldn't have done it anyway, you don't want them. So can you train people to cooperate? Not easily. I think that certainly you can train children to cooperate, but will that last to adulthood? I think what we see is that people are conditional cooperators. That means if they're in an environment where others do not cooperate, they will simply stop cooperating. You can train them from here to high heaven. But I think that it's in the nature of people. And certainly in my games, people were, the trustee, person 1 was very nice. And person 2 often was very nice. But you know that over time, these voluntary games have a universal result. Voluntary cooperation unravels. The reason it unravels is because people only want to cooperate if they see others. If they see any cheaters, any cheaters could ruin things. Plus, people often want to cooperate, but a little less than the other guys. If everyone's cooperating a little less in period T compared to what they saw others doing in T-1, you wait long enough and people are contributing nothing. So I think that we're hardwired to be very sensitive to how much others are cooperating, and that means that we have a system-wide problem, and just training a few people is not going to do the job. I think that it's going to require changing a whole system. That's why I think the example of the Nordic countries that were once corrupt and full of labor conflict, and today have achieved such successful institutions is very much worth studying. It points to the idea that institutions shape how cooperative people are, which shapes the institutions they choose, which shape how cooperative are. And so, to go back to my first slide, this business of how you think and how the economy works are really not different problems. They are interrelated. This is such an interesting topic. I could go on forever. But I guess I should go on to the second question. Noblesse oblige. This question was a little diffuse, and so I'll just pick out certain elements that I think I'm capable of responding to. The question was about fairness and social responsible behavior. So now I'm going to make an infomercial, and it's not going to be for my own work. It's going to be for a wonderful book that comes out this year by the economic historian Joel Mokyr called The Enlightened Economy. And it is about the following question. Why did England lead the Industrial Revolution? Why not France? Why not Italy? The argument in this book is that England, more than other countries, had developed an ideal of gentlemanly behavior, which was not about drinking fine wine or riding fine horses, but about being fair to business partners. Can you imagine? And if you wanted social esteem in the higher echelons of society, you had to look like a gentleman. And you had to belong to clubs for gentlemen. And these clubs monitored you and gossiped about you. And they might even throw you out if they found you guilty of ungentlemanly behavior. So even though at this stage of the game, England did not have the formal institutions to enforce complex contracts, much less the kind of globalizing economy that England was becoming, these social institutions and this social ideal of gentlemanly behavior, this idea of fairness and the social esteem to be gained by being fair. I mean, think of this. You get esteem by never cheating and by contributing to the hospital and to the canal, and there were all kinds of voluntary groups that created public goods, including regulations of professions. There were all kinds of new professions coming about, and they all self-regulated, and they sort of competed by who could be a better person. Now, we like to talk about the market as being this magical device that aligns private interest, private material interests, with social interests, but we know that it only does that if there's a price for every single action, which there never is. These social norms caused people to enforce and to internalize the alignment of private actions with the social good. And the modern world was born. So it's a really, really exciting idea. I don't know if it's true because I'm not an economic historian, but it's a great read.
If I can, I would like to make a question myself. I would like to make a very general question, so I hope that it's not too naive. And as is usual with economics, I would like to go back to Adam Smith. And as a result of your studies, how would you, or where would you draw the line between the idea that basically the most parsimonious way to think about society and institutions for good of society, starting from non-cooperative, selfish behavior, or the other way around, and think that selfish and non-cooperative behavior competition is an exception that could be curbed and made compatible with the good of society, which is in a sense the point that some historians of thought make, that Adam Smith has been turned upside down. It started from the idea that the general attitude of people is towards cooperation and being cooperative and moral sentiments, etc. And but then economists have pushed the idea that competition and selfishness are, first of all, dominant, and second, are not harmful. So this is a very general question, but I think it could be interesting to try to draw some conclusion, if it's possible, from your studies on these very general statements about the deep tendencies in society and how to model it.
My reading of Adam Smith is that he thought the fundamental factor driving behavior was a desire for social esteem. And he viewed the West as an exceptional society in aligning social esteem with consumerism and wealth acquisition. And he spoke a great deal about slave societies, where one got self-esteem, one got social esteem by acquiring more and more slaves. And he thought those societies would never go anywhere, because obviously more and more people would just get enslaved. That part of Adam Smith has been pretty much forgotten. The part about social esteem has been now recognized and is widely discussed. But what is often not discussed are what the sources of social esteem are. It's taken for granted that certain things will be estimable and certain things not. But there's no reason to take that for granted. That is an outcome of a social process. Charles Darwin loved to talk about the peacock's tail. And for a long time, Darwin was really troubled by the peacock's tail. Do you know if it rains and the tail gets too wet, the peacock can die? Because the tail is so heavy when it's wet, he can't move. And he starves to death. The life of a peacock is not easy. Similarly, the life of a person who's high caste is not easy. There's many things he can't do. Can't even cut his own toenails. It's viewed as polluting. Think how inconvenient that would be. And he has to constantly worry about not losing face. And that gives rise to these weird behaviors that we found in our game. So I think there's no question but that if we want to understand deep forces explaining differences in society, we simply have no choice but to think about what people think are the sources of social esteem and how those are shaped by their society. An optimistic result of the sociological work of a young Indian recent PhD at Harvard named Paramita Sanyal is that when you give women exposure to microfinance, and for the first time they get out of their houses, they have some control over money, they meet other women, and they get a sense of personal efficacy, that gets them to be more involved in village life and more active in playing the role of social enforcer, playing the kinds of roles that Joel Mokyr talked about. That the optimistic thing I think about these findings and experiments is that we are all potentially pro-social, and we all do care very much about how we fit into society. But the difficult thing is shaping a whole population in a society. I can take out any individual and adopt him and make him be very pro-social and cooperative if I take him to the right place. But if I have to deal with 1 billion people all interacting, that's the challenge. And I think some of the most exciting work going on today is work that deals simultaneously with the determinants of structure and the determinants of norms, solving them together.
are no other questions, I believe that we can conclude our meeting here. Thank you ever so much to Professor Hoff.
So thank you very much.